Saipan Island, July 1944. A woman clutches a grenade ready to kill herself and the children hiding with her in a dark cave. She hears boots approaching. American voices echo outside. She closes her eyes, convinced demons are coming. But when a face appears in the dim light, speaking perfect Japanese, everything she believed about monsters shatters in an instant. This is the story of how soldiers who looked like her saved lives the propaganda machine tried to destroy. The island of Saipan was never supposed to fall. Sitting in the Mariana Islands chain, just over 1,000 miles from Tokyo, it was considered sacred Japanese territory. More than 25,000 civilians lived there alongside the military garrison, farmers and teachers and shopkeepers who had built lives under the rising sun flag. They worked the sugarcane fields, sent their children to school, and believed what their government told them about the war. Akemi Nakamura was one of those believers. At 28 years old, she taught at the island's primary school, shaping young minds with lessons about duty, honor, and sacrifice. Her husband had died 2 years earlier fighting in the Philippines, declared a hero by the emperor himself. She wore black and carried his photograph everywhere. Her students loved her because she made history come alive, because she smiled even when discussing difficult subjects, because she never showed the grief that haunted her nights. One of those students was 7-year-old Yuki, a tiny girl with braided hair who always sat in the front row. Yuki's father had also died in combat, making her and Akemi share an unspoken bond. The child drew pictures of flowers and birds, innocent things untouched by the machinery of war, grinding closer each day. But innocence was dying across the Pacific. By June 1944, American forces had island-hopped their way through Japanese-held territory, leaving destruction in their wake. The propaganda machine in Tokyo worked overtime, pumping out images and stories designed to terrify the population into absolute resistance. Posters showed American soldiers as grotesque monsters, pale-skinned demons with fangs and claws. Radio broadcasts described atrocities in graphic detail, torture methods and mass killings that would make surrender worse than death. The word they used was oni, demons from ancient folklore, creatures that ate children and destroyed everything pure. The propaganda insisted Americans weren't human at all, but beasts wearing uniforms, animals that would violate women, murder babies, and feast on the flesh of the conquered. These weren't exaggerations meant to inspire courage. They were calculated lies designed to make death preferable to capture. Akemi heard these broadcasts every evening in the school's common room. She watched the other teachers' faces pale with fear, saw mothers pull their children closer. She felt her own stomach twist with dread, imagining what monsters would do if they ever reached Saipan. The thought of falling into their hands became worse than any nightmare. In early June, reality arrived with naval bombardment. American battleships appeared on the horizon and began systematically destroying military installations. The sound was unlike anything the civilians had experienced, a constant thunder that shook the ground and rattled teeth. Akemi gathered her students, 23 children ranging from 6 to 12 years old, and led them to the shelter beneath the school building. They huddled together in the darkness while the world exploded above them. The invasion began on June 15th. 30,000 American Marines stormed the beaches under withering fire. The Japanese garrison, 14,000 soldiers committed to fighting to the last man, made them pay for every yard of sand. The battle was brutal and intimate, fought in jungles and caves and ruined buildings. Neither side gave quarter. The Marines had learned hard lessons about Japanese tactics. The defenders followed orders that prohibited surrender under penalty of dishonor, worse than death. Caught between these forces were the civilians. Akemi tried to keep teaching, maintaining normalcy in a world falling apart. But parents stopped sending their children to school. Families began fleeing north away from the American advance. The colonial governor made speeches about sacrifice and duty, about how every Japanese citizen must be prepared to die for the emperor, rather than submit to the white demons coming to destroy them. Commander Ishikawa, a fanatical army officer responsible for civilian affairs, began distributing weapons, not rifles or machine guns, but grenades. He visited homes and shelters, pressing the deadly spheres into trembling hands, explaining with cold precision that these were tools of mercy. When the demons came, he said, families should huddle together, pull the pin, die with honor, spare yourselves the torment the Americans will inflict. Akemi received 2 grenades. She stared at them in her small apartment, these green metal eggs that represented her government's final solution. The message was clear. You are already dead. We just haven't told you when to stop breathing yet. By early July, the American advance had compressed the remaining Japanese forces and civilians into the northern tip of the island. The terrain there was dramatic. High cliffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean, caves riddled through limestone formations, dense jungle covering steep slopes. It became the last stand, a place where thousands would make their final choice. Private Daniel Bennett from Texas had never seen anything like Saipan before shipping out. At 22, he'd grown up on stories about cowboys and Indians, simplistic tales of good guys and bad guys. The Pacific War had complicated those stories considerably. He'd seen things in the past weeks that gave him nightmares. Combat so fierce and personal it changed who he was. But nothing prepared him for what happened as they pushed north. The Marines began encountering civilians, families emerging from hiding with hands raised or weapons drawn. The Americans had translators, Japanese-speaking soldiers trying to convince people to surrender safely. Sometimes it worked. Often it didn't. The propaganda had done its job too well. On July 7th, the Japanese military launched one final massive attack. Thousands of soldiers charging American positions in a suicidal banzai assault. It was slaughter. When dawn came, the beach was carpeted with bodies. The organized defense collapsed. What remained were scattered groups of soldiers and the civilians they'd been indoctrinating for months. That's when the cliffs became execution grounds. Banzai Cliff and Suicide Cliff, they would be called later, sites of incomprehensible tragedy. Families walked to the edges, parents holding children, elderly couples supporting each other. They jumped. They leaped into empty air and fell onto rocks and into churning water hundreds of feet below. Some threw their children first, hoping to spare them pain. Others clutched babies and went together. Daniel Bennett watched through binoculars from half a mile away, unable to process what he was seeing. He screamed for his commanding officer. Other Marines saw it too. They tried shooting in the air to scare people back from the edge. They waved white flags. They begged through loudspeakers in broken Japanese for the civilians to stop, promising safety, promising food and medical care. It rarely worked. The propaganda was stronger than reality. The people jumping off those cliffs genuinely believed death was mercy compared to what awaited them in American hands. They believed they were saving their families. They died believing a lie. Sergeant Harry Tanaka saw it too, and it broke something inside him. Born in Hawaii to Japanese immigrant parents, he'd grown up caught between two worlds. When the war started, his family was viewed with suspicion despite being American citizens. His parents were sent to internment camps. Harry joined the army to prove his loyalty, to show that his face didn't determine his allegiance. He'd fought across the Pacific, serving as a translator and intelligence specialist, trying to save lives by convincing Japanese soldiers and civilians that surrender wasn't dishonor. But Saipan was different. The mass suicides proved the propaganda had won, that his voice and face weren't enough to overcome years of indoctrination. He stood on that beach and watched people who looked like his parents, like his aunts and uncles, choose death over trusting him. It was the worst failure he'd ever experienced. Not everyone made it to the cliffs. Scattered throughout the northern jungle were caves, dozens of them, where civilians hid from both the battle and the impossible choice it demanded. That's where Akemi found herself with a small group. Yuki, her precious student who clutched a dirty stuffed rabbit. Sachiko, a desperate mother with a 6-month-old baby who wouldn't stop crying. And grandmother Hana, 68 years old, who whispered prayers to ancestors and gods alike. They'd been in the cave for 3 days. No food, little water. The sound of gunfire and explosions had faded, replaced by an eerie silence that felt worse. They knew what silence meant. It meant the battle was over. It meant the Americans had won. It meant the demons would be searching for survivors. Akemi held her 2 grenades. She'd decided. When the Americans found them, she would pull the pins on both, killing everyone in the cave quickly. It was the merciful choice. She'd explained this to grandmother Hana, who nodded with wet eyes. She hadn't told Yuki. The child didn't need to know. It would be fast. Sachiko rocked her baby, humming a lullaby that couldn't mask the infant's hunger cries. The young mother had her own grenade. Her plan was more specific. Throw the baby against the cave wall, then detonate. Quick deaths. Merciful deaths. Better than letting the white demons have them. They heard voices outside on the afternoon of July 9th. English words, harsh and guttural. Bootsteps on stone, radio static. Akimi's hands shook as she gripped the grenades. This was it. The moment she'd been taught to fear since childhood. The Oni had found them. Yuki started crying. Grandmother Hana pulled the child close, covering her mouth gently. Sachiko stood, baby in one arm, grenade in the other. Her eyes were wild, determined. Akemi nodded to her, a silent message. When they come in, we do it together. A shadow fell across the cave entrance. Bright sunlight behind made it impossible to see details, just a large silhouette, an American soldier with a rifle. This was the monster. This was the demon. Akemi's thumb found the grenade pin, then the shadow spoke. In perfect, unaccented Japanese. Please don't be afraid. We're not going to hurt you. We have food and water. We have doctors. Please come out safely. Akemi froze. The voice was wrong. Demons didn't speak Japanese. Demons didn't say please. She blinked, trying to understand. Sachiko lowered her grenade slightly, confused. The figure stepped into the cave and the light shifted enough for them to see his face. Asian features. Dark hair. Eyes that looked like theirs. Sergeant Harry Tanaka removed his helmet slowly, showing he was unarmed except for words. He knelt down, making himself smaller, less threatening. He spoke again in their language, gentle and patient. My name is Harry Tanaka. My parents came from Japan. I know you've been told terrible things about us. I know you're scared, but I promise you, on my honor and my family's honor, you are safe. No one will hurt you. Please, let us help you. It was impossible. The propaganda had shown them white monsters, pale demons with cruel faces. This was a Japanese man in an American uniform, speaking their language with kindness in his voice. Akimi's mind struggled to reconcile reality with expectation. Was this a trick? Some cruel deception before the real torture began? Behind Harry, another soldier appeared. Private Daniel Bennett, tall and pale. The very image of what they'd been taught to fear. But he wasn't snarling or brandishing weapons. He was holding canteens of water and ration packages. He looked young and tired and sad. When Yuki peeked out from behind Grandmother Hana, Daniel's face softened. He knelt too, setting down the supplies, backing away slowly. Harry continued talking, explaining that the battle was over, that thousands of civilians were already in American custody being fed and cared for, that families were being kept together. He promised they could keep their belongings. He said doctors would check the baby, who was clearly malnourished and dehydrated. He offered Grandmother Hana assistance, standing up. He smiled at Yuki and asked her name. Slowly, impossibly, the terror began cracking. These weren't demons. The one who looked like them was kind. The one who looked like the enemy was gentle. Everything the propaganda promised was absent. There was no violence, no cruelty, no monstrous behavior. Just two exhausted soldiers trying to save lives. Akemi's hands relaxed. The grenades slipped slightly. Harry saw them and his eyes widened, but he didn't lunge or shout. He just spoke quietly. Please put those down. You don't need them. I know you were told to use them. I know you were told death was better than this, but they lied to you. Please, give yourself a chance to see the truth. Sachiko broke first. The young mother collapsed, sobbing, clutching her baby. The weight of almost murdering her own child crashed down on her. Harry moved slowly forward, taking the grenade from her shaking hand with practiced care, disarming it. Daniel brought water, helping Sachiko drink, offering a canteen for the baby's lips. Grandmother Hana stood with Harry's assistance, her old bones protesting. She looked into his face, studying him. You are truly Japanese? She asked. My blood is, Harry replied. My loyalty is American, but my humanity is universal. The old woman nodded, understanding something deeper than nationality. She had lived long enough to know that evil comes in all faces, and so does good. Yuki approached Daniel cautiously. The big Texan had pulled out a chocolate bar, something impossibly rare and precious. He broke off a piece and offered it. The little girl looked at Akemi, asking permission without words. Akemi, still holding grenades but with loosening grip, nodded slightly. Yuki took the chocolate. It melted on her tongue. Sweetness she'd almost never known. She smiled. Daniel smiled back. That smile broke Akemi completely. She set down the grenades and wept. Great racking sobs that released 3 days of terror and weeks of propaganda and years of loss. She cried for her dead husband, for her students scattered or dead, for the people who jumped off cliffs believing lies. She cried because she'd been seconds away from murdering a child, and herself based on fear, manufactured by people who didn't care if she lived or died. Harry let her cry, understanding the release was necessary. When she could speak, Akemi asked the question haunting her. Why? Why would they lie to us like that? Why would they make us so afraid that death seemed better? Harry's expression was sad and knowing. Because terrified people fight harder. Because if you surrender, the war ends. They needed you to choose death over defeat. They needed you to believe Americans were monsters, so you'd never question dying for the Emperor's empire. Your government sacrificed you before the battle even started. It was the truth she hadn't wanted to see, but couldn't deny anymore. The grenades in her hands hadn't been mercy. They'd been murder-suicide demanded by leaders who treated civilians as expendable assets. Commander Ishikawa hadn't been protecting them. He'd been ensuring they died rather than becoming evidence of Japan's defeat. The walk out of the cave took only minutes but felt like traveling between worlds. Akemi carried Yuki. Sachiko held her baby close. Grandmother Hana leaned on Harry's arm. Daniel led the way, clearing the path, warning other Marines that civilians were coming out. They emerged into sunlight that seemed impossibly bright. The northern part of Saipan looked like the end of the world. Shattered trees, cratered earth, the smell of death and smoke. But among the destruction were clusters of civilians, hundreds of them, sitting under American guard but unharmed. Children playing, women receiving medical care, men being processed but not executed. The prisoners looked exhausted and traumatized but alive. A medic immediately took Sachiko and her baby to a field hospital. The infant was severely dehydrated but would survive. Grandmother Hana was given water and food, seated in the shade with other elderly survivors. Yuki stayed close to Akemi, still clutching the chocolate Daniel had given her. Over the following hours, Akemi learned the full scope of the tragedy. Over 8,000 Japanese civilians had died on Saipan, many by suicide, others caught in the fighting. But more than 10,000 had been captured alive. The Americans had set up refugee camps with food, water, medical care, and shelter. Families were kept together. Children were protected. It wasn't paradise, it was still a prison camp in a war zone, but it wasn't the hell the propaganda had promised. She saw Commander Ishikawa's body that evening. He'd died trying to force a group of teenagers to jump off a cliff, killed by a Marine sniper trying to save them. Some of the teens had died anyway. Others had been pulled back in time. The commander's face in death looked fanatical and empty, a true believer in an ideology that demanded death over defeat. Harry found Akemi sitting alone that night, staring at the ocean. He sat beside her quietly. After a long silence, she spoke. I was going to kill Yuki, and myself. I was seconds away. If you had been a white soldier who came into that cave first, I might have done it. I might have murdered a child because I was too afraid to trust reality over propaganda. But you didn't, Harry said gently. When given a chance to see the truth, you chose life. That takes more courage than dying for a lie. I don't feel courageous. I feel foolish. How could I believe such obvious lies? Because everyone you trusted told you those lies. Because the penalty for doubt was death or dishonor. Because propaganda works by surrounding you with false certainty until reality seems like the lie. You're not foolish, you're human. And now you're alive to tell the truth to others. Akemi looked at him. This man who embodied the contradiction that saved her. Japanese by blood, but American by choice. Proving that identity was more complex than the propaganda allowed. Your parents, she asked. What happened to them? Harry's face darkened. Internment camps in California. Imprisoned by the same government I fight for, suspected of disloyalty because their faces look like the enemy. I wear this uniform to prove them wrong, to show that loyalty isn't about ancestry. But it's hard. Every day I fight people who look like my family. Every day I face Americans who don't trust me because of my face. I'm saving Japanese lives to prove my American identity. It's exhausting. But you do it anyway. Because it's right. Because in the end, we're all just people trying to survive the machines our governments built. Saipan didn't have to end this way. The civilians didn't have to die. But the propaganda convinced them that I was the monster, when the real monsters were the ones who put grenades in their hands and called it mercy. They sat together until dawn, two people from opposite sides of a war finding common ground in grief and survival. Yuki slept between them, innocent of how close she'd come to death, dreaming whatever dreams children have when the world is ending and beginning at the same time. In the weeks that followed, Akemi became an interpreter herself, helping American forces communicate with other survivors. She explained the propaganda to officers who couldn't understand why civilians would rather die than be helped. She convinced other women hiding in caves to come out safely. She held babies while mothers received medical care. She translated stories of atrocity and loss and rare moments of grace. Daniel Bennett wrote letters home that tried to explain what he'd seen. He told his family about jumping civilians, about the lies that killed thousands, about a little girl named Yuki who showed him that the enemy had faces and names and humanity. His worldview, built on simplistic stories about good and evil, had shattered on Saipan's cliffs. He would never see war the same way again. Grandmother Hana lived another 30 years, eventually returning to Japan after the war ended. She told her grandchildren about the day she almost died believing American soldiers were demons, and how a young man with a Japanese face and American uniform taught her that evil wears many faces, and so does good. She kept the chocolate wrapper Daniel had given Yuki, a small piece of paper that represented choosing life over death, truth over propaganda. Sachiko raised her baby in the refugee camp and later in occupied Japan. She never forgot the moment she was seconds away from throwing her child against a cave wall, convinced it was mercy. She spent the rest of her life advocating for peace, telling her story to anyone who would listen, warning about the dangers of propaganda that makes death seem preferable to truth. Yuki grew up without her father, raised by Akemi, who became her adoptive mother after the war. She became a teacher herself, specializing in history, making sure students learned the full story of Saipan. She kept the photograph Daniel had sent her in 1952, showing him with his wife and children in Texas, a normal man living a normal life, proof that monsters only exist when we create them. Akemi Nakamura spent decades processing what happened on Saipan. She wrote a memoir in 1968 that became controversial in Japan, where many still preferred sanitized versions of the war that omitted civilian mass suicides and the propaganda that caused them. She refused to soften her story. She described holding grenades meant to kill children. She described the propaganda's lies. She described Harry Tanaka's face appearing in a cave entrance, the moment everything she'd believed cracked apart. Most importantly, she described the choice. The propaganda had tried to eliminate choice, to make death automatic and unquestioned. But in that cave, she'd been given an alternative. Trust what you've been told, or trust what you're seeing. Fear what they look like, or respond to how they act. Die for the Emperor's honor or live for your own humanity. She chose life. Thousands on Saipan chose death. The difference wasn't courage or cowardice, it was timing and chance and the accident of which cave you hid in, which soldier found you first, whether you had one more second to hesitate before pulling the pin. The Battle of Saipan officially ended on July 9, 1944, though scattered fighting continued for days. The Americans lost over 3,000 killed and 10,000 wounded. The Japanese garrison was virtually annihilated. Fewer than 1,000 of the original 14,000 defenders survived. And among the civilians, the final count was devastating. Over 8,000 dead, many by their own hands, believing they were saving themselves from monsters that never came. Harry Tanaka received a commendation for saving civilian lives on Saipan. He fought through the rest of the war, always carrying the weight of those who didn't trust him, didn't believe him, jumped off cliffs rather than accept help from a Japanese face in an American uniform. After the war, he worked as a translator during the Tokyo war crimes trials, helping to document the propaganda machine that killed so many. He married, had children, lived a quiet life in Hawaii. He never talked much about the war except to say that the worst wounds weren't from bullets, but from lies that made people fear rescue. The cliffs on northern Saipan became memorials. Japanese tourists visit Banzai Cliff and Suicide Cliff to mourn, to remember, to grapple with a history that's uncomfortable and tragic. Plaques describe what happened without softening it. The ocean still crashes on rocks that broke families who jumped believing they were demons below. It's a place of grief and hard lessons about the power of propaganda to override survival instinct. Daniel Bennett returned to Texas after the war and became a teacher. He never could articulate exactly what changed in him on Saipan, but his students noticed he taught history differently than others, with more nuance and less certainty about heroes and villains. He kept a photograph of Yuki on his desk, the little girl with braided hair who taught him that enemies are propaganda's invention, not reality's truth. The lesson of Saipan isn't just about World War II or Japanese propaganda or American military might. It's about what happens when governments convince populations that other humans aren't human at all, that death is preferable to encountering them, that fear should override evidence. The Japanese civilians were victims of their own government's lies long before American forces landed. But it's also a story about the power of individual choice in systems designed to eliminate choice. Akemi could have pulled those grenade pins. Sachiko could have killed her baby. Grandmother Hana could have refused Harry's hand. They were all trained to make those choices, all prepared by propaganda to see salvation as doom. The fact they hesitated, that they gave reality one more second to intrude on fear, that they chose to trust what they were seeing over what they'd been told, that's what separates their survival from the thousands who died on the cliffs. Harry Tanaka's face saved lives because it interrupted the narrative. The propaganda had prepared civilians for white demons, not Japanese-American soldiers. That moment of confusion, that crack in certainty, created space for choice to exist. His words mattered because his face made them listen long enough to hear them. He was the contradiction that broke the spell, proof that the world was more complex than the binary the propaganda demanded. Today, the story of Saipan's civilian tragedy is taught in Japanese schools, though often uncomfortably. It raises hard questions about wartime government responsibility, about the ethics of propaganda, about how ideology can override the survival instinct. It's a reminder that the cruelest weapons aren't always bombs and bullets. Sometimes they're lies that make people willing to die rather than trust their own eyes. Akemi lived to 91, dying in 2007. Her memoir has been translated into 12 languages. In it, she describes that moment in the cave when Harry Tanaka's face appeared, when everything she'd been taught collided with what she was experiencing. She writes that propaganda's greatest power isn't making you believe lies, it's making you afraid to question them. And its greatest weakness is reality, the persistent, stubborn truth that eventually intrudes no matter how many lies surround it. Her final chapter is dedicated to Yuki, to Sachiko's baby who lived, to grandmother Hana who survived to tell her story. She writes about Daniel Bennett sending chocolate to a little Japanese girl when he had no reason except kindness. She writes about Harry Tanaka fighting for a country that imprisoned his parents, saving people from his ancestors' homeland. She writes about complexity in a world that demands simplicity, humanity in systems built to dehumanize. The last line of her memoir reads, "I was taught to fear monsters and saved by men. I was told death was mercy and found life was courage. I believed lies until I had no choice but to face truth. The greatest gift Harry and Daniel gave me wasn't safety. It was the chance to choose differently than I was programmed to choose. That's what freedom actually means." Saipan stands today as both a tragedy and a lesson. The civilians who died believed they were making the honorable choice, saving their families from torture and death. They weren't cowards or fanatics. They were ordinary people trapped in an extraordinary lie that made death seem logical. Their tragedy was being convinced that soldiers who looked like Harry and Daniel, who carried water and chocolate instead of cruelty, were the monsters to fear. The real monsters were the ones who distributed grenades to mothers and children, who filled radio broadcasts with tales of atrocities that never happened, who made an entire population prefer death to the possibility of mercy from people they were taught to see as demons. The real monsters were the ideology that treated civilians as expendable propaganda tools, the military code that made surrender worse than death, the system that valued abstract honor over actual lives. If you learned something from this story about how propaganda works, about how fear can override reason, about how complexity gets erased in wartime narratives, subscribe to this channel for more untold stories from history. Leave a comment about other World War II events you'd like to see covered, and hit the like button to help others discover these important lessons about humanity in the darkest times. History isn't just about battles and dates. It's about people making impossible choices in impossible circumstances. sometimes choosing life when everything around them demands death.